Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. Our learning is Nishmas Mendel, Mariam Bas Kalman Ruven, and Neshama Shevan Aliyah. We're going to learn a little bit, wrap up a little bit of our conversation about knotting, tying, and then get into some Gemaras about folding things on Shabbos. What is a person allowed to fold and not fold on Shabbos, as well as the clothing that we wear on Shabbos. Okay, so here we go. So a lot of material to cover. Kosher and li b'sik. How do you pronounce that? B'fsikya. Okay, a person's allowed to tie a pail with a girdle. A girdle is basically something the person's going to be using on Shabbos, avalo b'chevel, but not with a rope. Okay, so the basic premise over here is that it's not so much about the way you tie it, it's more about the fact, and we saw this principle before, that if it's something that we know that you're going to be using later, then it is not going to be forbidden. Rabbi Yehuda matir. Rabbi Yehuda, though, permits it even with a rope. And we'll analyze why he allows it with a rope. And then we have a general rule of Rabbi Yehuda. This is really not in response to the first halacha, it's response to a mayor. A mayor, if you remember, in an earlier Mishnah said, any knot that could be untied with one hand, then it's permitted. Rabbi Yehuda argues, he says it's not about how you untie it, but rather it's all about whether it's permanent or not. If it's not permanent, then one is not liable. Okay, ask the Gemara, Chevel Demai, what rope, when Rabbi Yehuda said that you were allowed to tie a pail, by the way, just to clarify, we're talking about a pail lowering into a well, which is quite common back in the day, that's how you got water, so this is also quite necessary. So when he says that you are allowed to tie a pail with a rope, Chevel Demai, what type of rope is he talking about? If you want to say he's talking about an ordinary rope, Rabbi Yehuda matir, Rabbi Yehuda allows us, tying with a regular rope is going to be permanent. In other words, a person goes ahead, the way they made the way they drew water back in the day, they tied a rope and they left it there for months, for years, as long as it remained. Ella Chevel de Gardi. It must be we're talking about a weaver's rope, and the point is that this is a rope that's going to be used for his work, and therefore it's not going to be permanent, and that's why it's being allowed. So it's not like a regular rope, but rather it's a rope that has a specific function that is going to, by definition, be removed at some point shortly, and therefore it's not considered permanently. Says the Gemara, now, why would the rabbis disagree? In our Mishnah, the rabbi said, no, only a girdle, not a rope. So why not? If we're talking about a weaver's rope, Rabbi Yehuda is right. It's going to be something that's going to be removed. Why did the Rabbanan not allow it? It must be that they decree using a weaver's rope, not because there's something intrinsically wrong with it, but because it could be confused with a regular rope. People are not going to distinguish between them. Rabbi Yehuda suffer lo gazrin, and Rabbi Yehuda holds we don't make that decree. However, if that is the case, there's a contradiction. Raminu, we have a brisa which seems to contradict this conclusion. If the rope of a pail snapped in the middle, okay, which is probably pretty common back, you have a rope, you're using it over and over and over again, and eventually it snaps. Lo kasher. The Mishnah, the brisa says you're not allowed to tie it with an ordinary knot because it's going to be permanent. Ela onvo. Rather, says the Tanakama, the Chachamim, you are allowed to make a bow on Shabbos to keep it together. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, korech ala punda o piskaya. Piskaya, you're allowed to wind a belt or a girdle around it. Okay, uvilvach lo yadvenu, but you're not allowed to make a bow. Okay, so what's going on over here? On the one, so Rabbi Yehuda, now everyone knows a bow is theoretically not problematic. The problem is that over here in this context, since it's something that's going to be used over and over again for drawing water, and you want it to remain, so it seems like Rabbi Yehuda is concerned that if I make a bow, I might get confused with another rope. So in this price, it's the opposite. The Rabbanan are saying Rabbi Yehuda saying that we do make a decree about bowing that even though it could be comparable because it could be Rabbi Yehuda says you're not allowed to make a bow. Why? Because he says it's comparable to making a regular knot, and therefore he says it's usher. The Rabbanan over here are saying you're allowed to make a bow, and they're not concerned about it being confused with the regular case of knotting. So what's going on in our Mishnah? Rabbi Yehuda is the one who is machmir, saying you can't go ahead. Sorry, Yehuda is the one who is makel and says you could use a rope. Right? He's not concerned of mixing it up with another rope. And the Rabbanan are saying you can't use a rope because you're going to confuse it with a regular. You can't use a weaver's rope, you're going to mix it up with a regular rope. Over here, when it comes to tying, the Rabbanan are saying you're allowed to do so. Clearly not concerned they're going to confuse it with the case of making a knot. And Rabbi Yehuda is being machmir and saying you can't make a bow, you're going to confuse it with the case of making a regular knot. Okay? So Kash Rabbi Yehuda, Kash Rabbanan, contradiction. So the Gemara says, Rabbanan lo Kash on the next page. There's no contradiction. Chevel bechevel michlaf. Two types of ropes, a weaver rope and a regular rope, you could confuse those. Aniva b'kshira lo mechalfa. But making a bow is not going to be confused with tying a knot. And therefore there's no contradiction. It's not that they have this general rule, we're not concerned about confusion, about mix-ups. It's the question is what? If it's one type, a weaver's knot and a regular knot, a weaver's rope and a regular rope, the Rabbanan are concerned you're going to mix them up, and therefore they say you can't even use a weaver's rope. But if we're talking about bowing Is that a term? Is that a verb? Whatever. Making a bow, as opposed to making a knot with a rope, they're not concerned about mixing it up. To Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha, and Rabbi Yehuda is not a question why. Hasam lo mishum nechalfa aniva b'kshira el aniva gufa kshirahi. It's not because of mixing up. We assume that the reason Rabbi Yehuda does not allow making a bow is because it's similar to tying a knot. Rather, Rabbi Yehuda has a new opinion we were not aware of until now, and that is Rabbi Yehuda holds that making a bow is actually usher on Shabbos, and that's why he prohibits making the bow in the case where the knot of the rope of the buckets, the pail, snaps. Okay.
We shouldn't talk about bowing in general. They're not having a good time.
Good. Okay, sorry, that took me a second. Good. Amar Rav Ava, Amar Rav Chia, Amar Rashi, Amar Rav. Maybe Adam Chelam Mitoch Beis, a person allowed to bring a rope from his house, Bekosher Bapara over Avos, and tie one end to your cow and one end into the feeding receptacle. Okay, apparently this was done to keep the cow eating. We should do this with our children. They sit down for like 3 seconds and then they run off and they didn't eat anything. So what they would do is they tie the cow to the bowl. And that way they made sure that they ate it. Just kidding. Don't do this to your children. Okay. So Rav Ava says you're what? Exactly. The assumption is it's temporary knot, right? We're not going to do this forever. We're going to untie it. So, and the assumption you're going to untie it on both ends, because if you leave one side tied forever, then that would be a permanent knot. That's Rav Abba's chiddush. Okay, Rav Abba's chiddush in the name of Rav. Eisvei Rav Acha Aricha Dehu Rav Acha Bar Papa Rav Abba. Question was posed: Chevel shebe'evos kosher b'para, a rope which one end is tied to a feeding receptacle, you're allowed to tie the other end to a cow. Vishabapara, and if one side is already tied to a cow, kosher be'evos, you're allowed to tie it to the feeding receptacle. But what you cannot do is what we just said you're allowed to do. You cannot go and tie both sides together. Okay, so this seems to be a contradiction. So Hasam Gemara says no. Hasam chevel the alma. The brisa, which is limited, is prohibitive, the one that says you can't tie both sides together. That's talking about one which is a regular rope, and there's a concern that if you tie both ends, you might leave one end tied up, because you have no need for that rope other than keeping things tied. When we had this previous statement which said you're allowed to tie both sides, we're talking about a weaver's rope. And again, a weaver's rope, like we saw in our Mishnah, we're not concerned that a person's going to leave it tied because it's going to be needed for other things. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Klei Kivai Mutal Tatzl B'Shabbos is permitted to move weaver's implements on Shabbos. Now, what is the point? The point is like this. There is a general principle, and there's different ways to read this Mishnah, but there's a general principle that if things are used for very technical or very fine types of work, there is this concept that a person would not want those utensils being used for other purposes, and therefore they're like off limits on Shabbos. Okay, so when it comes to laws of muktzah, for example, if you have a hammer, you're not supposed to use a hammer on Shabbos because they're typically for nails. But if you have a nut that you want to break, or let's say this comes up a lot, you have a screwdriver. A screwdriver can be used for Shabbos, but if you have a easily undone lock that you want to undo on Shabbos. So my kids, like every single day, will lock themselves in a room, and so a screwdriver, so it's an easy undoable lock. So you'd be allowed to take the screwdriver because it's a klish malach l'isser. You're using it for a davar heter, no problem. I'm allowed to use a scissor for a davar heter. But if it's something which is like a very unique type of utensil, it's something which is used for like very fine activity that the owner would be very cautious around using. It's not a hammer, it's not a screwdriver, it's potentially a weaver's implement, something which is like used for a specific skill set. So there is, we generally treat that as muksa machmas chisaron kis. It's a unique category of muksa that even if you could find a permissible usage on Shabbos, like what do you mean? I could use this thing for whatever a very specific purpose that is going to be helpful for me. Too bad, since the owner typically would not want someone to touch that because it's going to be ruined or could be ruined. It therefore becomes muksa to the point you can't use it for anything, even for a permissible purpose. Okay. So the question is, what about a weaver's implements? Are those considered muksa or not? So he says they're not muksa. You're allowed to use these implements because a weaver would not be concerned. In other words, they're not so specialized that a weaver would be concerned that you're going to use them, and therefore it's permitted. By me name Rav Yehuda. Okay, what about the upper beam and the lower beam? Okay, the weaver element. If you've ever seen like an ancient weaver thing, it has a whole bunch of contraptions. So you have the bottom piece and the top piece. Those are though he's asking now. What about all? Right, initially he just asked the general question. Now he's zooming in to some of the particular pieces, and he says, what about the upper beam and the lower beam of the weaver contraption? So says the Gemara on the next page. In Vilav V'Rafya B'Dei. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda would waver between yes and no. Sometimes he would say yes, sometimes he would say no. He wasn't sure. Okay, Itzmar. So now we're going to clarify what the halach is. Itzmar, it was stated, Amar Nachman Shmuel Klei Kivai Mutal Tatzla Shabbos. You're allowed to move the weaver's implements on Shabbos. Afilu Kavod Elam Kavod Tachton. Okay, even the upper beams and lower beams. So here we have a clear ruling that they're permitted. Avalo es ha'amudim, not the posts. Okay, the posts are the things that actually go into the ground to hold the weaver machine down. In other words, if you have a weaver machine that is not attached to the ground, it's going to move around, it's going to cause problems. So basically they would do is they have two poles that were stuck into the ground, posts that were stuck into the ground, those can't be moved. Okay, we're going to see why that is in a moment. Ravler of Nachman, why can you not move the post? If the concern is that you're making holes in the ground, if that's the issue, that if you're moving the posts are stuck in the ground, you pick them up, you're making holes. So gumos mela kahavyan. The Gemara pushes back. He says the holes, those you're not making, they come into existence on their own. In other words, you by pulling it out, you're not making holes. The hole's there. You just are removing something from the hole. That's not an issue. It's not. We learned in the Mishnah, hatomi lefes utznonos tachas agefen. A person who buries turnip or radishes in the ground under a grapevine for storage. Im mixas alav migulan. If some of the leaves are exposed, again, you have turnips or radishes under a grapevine. If some of the leaves are exposed, eno choshenom to be concerned l'misham kilayim, misham l'shvius, l'misham meiser, then there is no issue of kilayim, of two different products being buried together, in Israel. Actually, whatever. It depends on whatever. Basically, you have to have two species next to one another, and therefore there's no issue because it's not really buried if some of the leaves are exposed. There's no issue of planting on shvius because on shmita because it's not fully exposed, and it's not chai for meiser because it's part of it's exposed. It's not really considered buried. And here's the key word: v'nital Shabbos, you're allowed to pick up the radish or the turnip from the ground. Why? Right? Because why? Are you allowed to pick it up and take it out of the ground? Why? Because the hole that's made is just happening on its own. The hole's already there. I'm just taking something out of a hole. I didn't make a hole. And therefore here too, why can't I take the post out? So Gemara says, Besada lo asi lashvir gumos. In the Mishnah you just quoted, you're talking about in a field. In a field, when you leave a hole, that's fine. You're not going to go ahead and start filling the hole. Hacha b'bayis. We're talking about a weaver contraption that's in a house. The concern isn't that you're making the hole. The concern is that when you remove the posts, asta lashvia gumas, you're going to go then and fill up the holes, and that is a prohibition of bona. So it's a decree against bona. You can't go ahead. Now keep in mind, their homes are made of dirt floors, right? So if you were to go ahead and make a hole in your floor, the hole isn't the problem. The problem is that if you made a hole, there's a very likely possibility that you're going to go ahead and fill that hole, and that would be an issue of bona, of building on Shabbos. Okay, by Rav Yochanan, Rav Yehuda bar Levi, Klei Kivai Kigon Koved Elyon v'Choved Tachton Mal Taltal Shabbos. Okay, we have a different opinion. What about moving the upper beam and the lower beam of the weaver implements? Amrle Aim Talton. You can't do so. Matam. What's the reason? Lefisha Initam, because they are not moved. What does that mean? So the Mefarshim explain that something which is so heavy that is not typically moved, it's therefore considered muksa. Okay, it's a big discussion about moving like heavy items around your house. Like, are you allowed to, if let's say you have a heavy couch, are you allowed to move it around in your house on Shabbos? So a couch or something like that, which is typically movable, most say if you need to move it for Shabbos, you could, but you shouldn't just you can't just rearrange furniture on Shabbos just because I move into a new house or whatever it is, or get new furniture and you're still moving things around. You shouldn't be doing that on Shabbos. If you have a specific Shabbos need, it would be allowed, but otherwise moving a heavy object would be considered muksa on Shabbos. Okay, let's get into folding. Says the Mishnah, a person allowed to fold garments even 4 or 5 times on Shabbos. We'll qualify that significantly soon. But basically, the Mishnah says you're allowed to fold garments on Shabbos. Okay, you're allowed to make the bed on the night of Shabbos for Shabbos. Avalomi Shabbos Matzei Shabbos. You're allowed to make the bed on Shabbos for Matzei Shabbos. What that means is that it's achana. If you're making your bed on Shabbos for Matzei Shabbos, then you're doing it because you're preparing for after Shabbos. Okay, so let's just qualify that second halacha before we get into folding, before we get back into folding. But the point is that if a person, it really will be somewhat subjective. And that is if a person is the type of person who they want their beds to be folded, and they basically want to walk into the room and their beds need to be folded. If not, you feel uncomfortable, okay? So you're that type of person, then folding your bed, you're not doing it for Matzei Shabbos, you're doing it for now. I want to be in a clean room. I want to be in a clean house. And therefore, if I took a nap on Shabbos afternoon and I want my bed to be folded because it makes me uncomfortable to have an unfolded bed, that's not considered doing it for Matzei Shabbos. You're doing it for now, and that therefore it's allowed. Okay? It's only if a person is only typically going to fold it, so that'll be ready for later. That's already preparing. That's achana for after Shabbos. Okay? Let's turn the page. Rabbi Shmuel Omer. Okay? Nowadays, this isn't going to be ever an issue, but back in the day, their calendar was not set, and therefore you could have Yom Kippur, which goes Friday Yom Kippur and then Shabbos. Imagine that. Okay? So that would be wild. Okay? So basically, they have Yom Kippur and then go straight into Shabbos. He says you're allowed to fold garments and make the bed Yom Kippur for Shabbos because Shabbos, according to Rabbi Shmuel, klal is more holy than Yom Kippur, and therefore it's not a problem. And similarly, v'chelvei shlamim krevim Yom Kippurin. Shabbos, chelvei Shabbos krevim Yom Kippurin. Let's say you avaloshel Yom Kippurim Shabbos. Let's say it's Shabbos and then goes into Yom Kippur, and you didn't finish burning all the fats or everything that all the karbanos had to be burnt on Shabbos. You're allowed to do so on Yom Kippur. The Yom Kippur the next day. Avaloshel Yom Kippur Shabbos. But if Friday is Yom Kippur and it goes into Shabbos, you're not allowed to burn the remaining fats on Shabbos that left over for Yom Kippur because it's like a weekday thing. It's a lower holiness for a higher holiness. Rabbi Kiva Omer Loshel Shabbos Krevim Yom Kippur Loshel Yom Kippurim Krevim Shabbos. Rabbi Kiva disagrees with Rabbi Shmuel across the board. He says Shabbos and Yom Kippur actually have the same sanctity, and therefore you're not allowed to go from one to the other at all. Okay. Amri Dever of Yane. Lo Shanu El Badamecha. That we said you're allowed to permit folding garments. We're going to see there's many qualifications. A, it has to be done by one person. What's the issue if you do it with two people? Then you're going to do it very, very, very tightly, right? If you fold something with two people, it becomes very tight. And different ways of understanding the issue. Some will say the issue is then it's like fixing your utensil. It's really doing something a little bit more, but you're basically taking the creases out, and it's essentially fixing the utensil. It can't be done with two people. Okay? Aval b'shnei adam lo. Can't be folded by two people. Uva adam echad nami, even regarding one person. Lo amran el b'chadashim. It's only if it's new clothing. Aval b'yishanim lo. Once it's old clothing, which is already somewhat wrinkled, and you start folding it, you're going to take out the wrinkles, and again, you're fixing your kli on Shabbos. V'chadashim nami. And even if it's new, lo amran el bilvanim. It's only with white garments. Aval b'tzvuim lo. If they are color garments, it's prohibited, because with white garments, you don't see the creases as much, and therefore it's not as much of a change. V'lo amrun el she'en lo lahachlif. And on top of that, it's only if you have no other clothing to change into. Aval yesh lahachlif. If you have other clothing to change into, lo, you're not allowed to fold your clothing. Let's just do on Brisa. Tana, it was taught on Brisa. Shalbetzer Ramliel in the house of Ramliel. Lo hemakaplim klei lavan shalahen. They would not fold their white garments, even though white we said is fine. Because they were wealthy, they had other garments in which to change into, and therefore they wouldn't fold their white garments. Bottom line is, it is asur on Shabbos, not so well known, to fold things on the crease. You're not allowed to fold things on the crease. If you have a pair of pants, shirt. Again, shirt's not. Depends on the type of product. You're allowed to fold a shirt which doesn't have creases. That's not an issue. The issue is folding something on the crease. So a pair of pants typically have a crease. Folding those on Shabbos would be prohibited across the board, and therefore can't fold it. A talis is a big thing. People fold talisim on Shabbos. What you're allowed to do is fold it. I don't forget if the Gemara says it or no. You're allowed to fold it against the crease. You're allowed to fold it like the opposite crease. That is allowed. The Mishnah says even that ideally you shouldn't do, but there's certainly what to rely upon to fold it against the crease. When you fold it backwards, you'll see some people leave their talis like schlumped up. Sometimes I do it because I'm lazy, not because I do fold it against the crease. Sometimes I'm just in a rush, so I just put it down. But you are allowed to fold it against the crease. But the Mishnah says even better, just don't fold it at all. But the bottom line is folding anything on the crease is asur on Shabbos as a form of fixing utensil on Shabbos. So you just leave it out. You don't fold it up on Shabbos. Okay? Okay, let's talk about clothing on Shabbos. Amar Rav Huna. Im yesh lo hachlif. If a person has other clothing than their weekday clothing. Again, that wasn't a given back in the day. Sometimes people had only one pair of clothing and that's all they wore. But if you are so lucky, so fortunate to have more than one piece of clothing, then you should change it on for Shabbos. If you don't have another piece of clothing, yishal shel bivgadav. You should let your weekday clothing down. What does that mean? What that means is that the poor people, they were typically laborers. Now, a laborer doesn't want to be tripped up. You just want to wear like very comfortable clothing if you're a laborer. There's a reason that laborers are going to wear like jeans and a t-shirt. They're not going to wear like a suit or whatever, obviously, because it's going to be like get uncomfortable, right? So it's going to get in the way of their work. So typically back in the day, workers would keep their clothing. They would workers would go ahead and keep their clothing like pulled up so that it wouldn't get in their way. Again, everyone wore robes, but they would kind of pull the robe up. So on Shabbos, they should let their robes down. Okay? That's what they should do, to show it's something different. But doing so appears like you're being haughty. In other words, only like very wealthy people, and it seems like an arrogant move to lower your clothing. So he says, no. Since every day this is not done, and it's only being done on Shabbos, it doesn't appear to be haughty. Very interesting principle. So the point is that if you're wearing like special clothing on Shabbos, there's a general principle. We don't want to appear like in a haughty fashion. We don't want to do things which are like over the top. There's a problem with doing so. But if every day you dress simply, and on Shabbos you dress very nicely, then it's clear that you're not doing it out of arrogance. It's clear you're doing it out of the honor of Shabbos. But to do this every day, That would be problematic. Okay, now we see the pasuk which speaks about the importance of doing things different on Shabbos. Pasuk in Yeshaya says you should honor Shabbos by not doing your ways. Okay, so now we interpret this pasuk. What does it mean to honor Shabbos? So that is interpreted to mean your Shabbos clothing should not be like your weekday clothing. The postscript goes so far as to say that as many articles of clothing possible on Shabbos. If you could have a different shirt on Shabbos, meaning for some of us who wear like white shirts, is that do you tell the difference? Okay, slightly, but the point is that no. Everything, as much as you can, everything should be different on Shabbos. Not just like your outer clothing, as much as you can on Shabbos should be different. V'chihad Rav Yochanan, and we support this idea that the word v'chibato means that you should wear different clothing. Kar lemane mechabdusai. He would refer to his clothing as the things that honor me. So you see the word kibud, honor, is a reference to clothing. Ma'aseh d'rachacha, the pasuk continues and says, by not doing your ways. What does that mean? You should walk differently on Shabbos than you do on the weekday. We're going to talk about that tomorrow, God willing. But there really is a halacha that you should walk differently on Shabbos, okay? From seeking your wants. What does that mean? You're not allowed to talk about your wants, your business on Shabbos. You're allowed to talk about mitzvah-related wants on Shabbos. You're allowed to talk about mitzvah business. If you're talking about shul business on Shabbos, it is 100% mutter. If you're talking about school business on Shabbos, you could have a shul board meeting on Shabbos. Don't get any ideas. But you could have a shul board meeting on Shabbos, even though you go through a financial, they go through financial records, because that's okay. You're not allowed to talk about your needs, but if it's chavtzei shamayim, if it's for heaven, then it's allowed. V'davar, and speaking words. You're not allowed your speech on Shabbos should not be like your speech on a weekday, and we'll define what that means tomorrow as well. Dibur asur, speaking is forbidden. Here mutter, thoughts which are not relevant to Shabbos are permitted, but speaking about them are asur. Actually, so far as there were people who would speak in Hebrew only on Shabbos as a fulfillment of this. It's not the requirement, but trying to really speak differently, they would go that far. Have a great day. We'll pick up and analyze this tomorrow.